In 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl led the French army to victory. She could not read. She could not write. She had never held a sword. And yet, in just 9 days, she broke a siege that had lasted 6 months. Her name was Joan of Arc, and she changed history because she believed God told her to. This is her story, the whole story, told calmly from the very beginning to the very end. It starts in a small village, a place most people have never heard of, a farming community on the edge of a kingdom that was falling apart. Joan was born there around 1412. Her father worked the land. Her mother taught her to pray. She grew up spinning wool, tending animals, and going to church. There was nothing unusual about her, nothing that would make anyone look twice. But France in those years was not a normal place. It was a country at war, and it had been at war for a very long time. By the time Joan was born, the fighting had already gone on for 75 years. Fathers had passed it down to sons. Sons had passed it down to grandsons. Entire generations had lived and died without ever knowing peace. The English claimed the French throne. French nobles fought each other almost as much as they fought the invaders. And the king, the man who was supposed to hold everything together, had gone mad. His name was Charles VI. He ruled France for over 40 years. But for much of that time, he did not know who he was. He forgot his own name. He did not recognize his wife or children. Some days he believed his body was made of glass and that he would shatter if anyone touched him. His court tried to hide it. They ruled in his name while he wandered the halls of his palace, lost inside his own mind. And while the king slipped further into madness, the kingdom slipped further into chaos. The great nobles divided into factions. They murdered each other. They made deals with the English. They sold out their own country for power and revenge. The English took advantage of every crack. They won battle after battle. They captured cities. They burned villages. And in 1420 they forced the mad king to sign a treaty that gave away everything. The Treaty of Troyes, that was its name. And it said that when Charles VI died, the crown of France would pass not to his own son, but to the King of England. The heir, the Dauphin Charles, was declared illegitimate, cast out, erased from the line of succession by his own father. He fled south with what little support he had left. His enemies called him the King of Bourges, mocking the small territory he still controlled. He had almost no money, almost no army, and almost no hope. That was the France Joan of Arc was born into. A broken land waiting for something, or someone, to change its fate. To understand how France fell so far, we need to go back. Back before Joan was born. Back before her parents were born. Back to the year 1328, when a French king died without a son. His name was Charles IV. He was the last of a dynasty called the Capetians, a family that had ruled France for over 300 years. When he died, the throne should have passed to his closest male relative. But there was a problem. The closest male relative was not French, he was English. Edward III, King of England, was the nephew of Charles IV. His mother, Isabella, had been a French princess. By blood, Edward had a strong claim to the French crown, perhaps the strongest claim of anyone alive. But the French nobles refused to accept him. They did not want an English king, so they found a reason to reject his claim. They said the crown could not pass through a woman. Isabella could not transmit a right she herself could not hold. It was a convenient argument, and it kept the throne in French hands. Instead of Edward, they chose Philip of Valois, a French cousin, a safer choice. He became Philip Tig, the first king of a new dynasty. Edward accepted this at first. He was young. He had problems at home. He even paid homage to Philip for the lands he held in France, acknowledging Philip as his overlord. But the wound never fully healed, and as the years passed, the tension grew. The two kingdoms clashed over trade, over territory, over influence in the wealthy region of Flanders. Small conflicts became larger ones. Diplomacy failed again and again. And in 1337, Philip VI declared that he was seizing all of Edward's French lands. Edward's response changed everything. He did not just fight back. He declared that Philip was not the true king of France. He, Edward III of England, was the rightful heir, and he would take what was his by force. The 100 Years' War had begun. It did not start well for France. In 1340, the English destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of Sluys. Almost every French ship was captured or sunk. Control of the English Channel belonged to England now. French ports were no longer safe. Then came the Land War, and it was worse. In 1346, Edward III invaded northern France with a large army. Philip VI gathered his forces and moved to intercept. The two armies met near a village called Crécy. What happened there shocked all of Europe. The French army was larger. It had more knights, more nobles, more heavy cavalry. These were the finest warriors in Christendom, men who had trained their whole lives for battle. They were supposed to sweep the English from the field. But the English had something the French did not expect. Longbowmen, thousands of them. Common soldiers, not nobles, armed with tall wooden bows that could send arrows through armour at 200 yards. The French knights charged. The arrows fell like rain. Horses screamed and tumbled. Men in heavy armour collapsed in the mud. Charge after charge broke against that wall of arrows. By the time night fell, the flower of French chivalry lay dead on the field. Thousands of knights, dozens of great nobles, the Count of Flanders, the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Lorraine. Philip VI escaped, but his army was destroyed, and France learned a terrible lesson. Courage was not enough. Honour was not enough. The old ways of war no longer worked. 10 years later, it happened again. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This time, the English were led by Edward's son, the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince for the colour of his armour. Once again, the French had more men. Once again, they charged with confidence. Once again, they were slaughtered. But Poitiers was even worse than Crécy, because this time the French king himself was captured. John II, who had succeeded Philip VI, was taken prisoner on the battlefield. He was brought to England and held for ransom. The price was staggering. 3 million gold crowns. It would take years to raise that much money. And while France struggled to pay, their king sat in comfortable captivity in London, playing chess and waiting. The kingdom fell into chaos. Without a strong king, the nobles fought among themselves. Peasants, crushed by taxes to pay the ransom, rose up in a bloody revolt called the Jacquerie. They burned castles, they killed lords, and they were eventually crushed with terrible brutality. Then came the plague. The Black Death had already swept through Europe once in 1348, killing perhaps a third of the population, but it kept coming back. Wave after wave, year after year. Villages that had survived the war were emptied by disease. Fields went unplanted. Roads fell into disrepair. The living were too few to bury the dead. France in the late 1300s was a land of ghosts. Ruined castles, abandoned farms, bands of unemployed soldiers roaming the countryside, robbing and killing because there was no one to stop them. The war paused sometimes, not because anyone wanted peace, but because there was no one left to fight. And then just when it seemed things might stabilise, the madness came. Charles VI became king in 1380, when he was only 11 years old. For a while he seemed capable. He took control of the government as a young man. He showed signs of being a good ruler. People began to hope. Then in 1392 everything changed. The king was riding through a forest with his men when something startled him. No one knows exactly what. A loud noise, a figure in the trees. But Charles suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own companions. He killed several of them before he could be restrained. When he finally calmed down, he had no memory of what he had done. It was the first episode. It would not be the last. For the next 30 years, Charles VI drifted in and out of madness. Sometimes he was lucid, able to rule, able to recognize his family. Other times, he was lost completely. He ran through the halls of his palace, howling. He refused to bathe for months. He could not remember that he was king. He did not know his own children. The court tried to manage him. They tried to hide his condition, but everyone knew. And in that knowledge, powerful men saw opportunity. Two factions formed. The Armagnacs, led by the Count of Armagnac and loyal to the royal family, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy, who controlled vast territories in the east and wanted more power. These two groups hated each other, and with a mad king on the throne, there was no one to keep them in check. They fought, they schemed, they murdered. In 1407, the Duke of Burgundy had the Duke of Orléans, the king's own brother, assassinated in the streets of Paris. It was brazen, it was brutal, and it split France in two. While French nobles killed French nobles, the English watched and waited. A new king had come to the throne in England, a young man with cold eyes and burning ambition. His name was Henry V, and he saw that France was ripe for the taking. The stage was set for the greatest disaster in French history. Henry V was not like the English kings who came before him. He was focused, disciplined, ruthless when he needed to be, and he believed with absolute certainty that the French crown belonged to him. He prepared carefully. He built a fleet. He trained his army. He studied the divisions tearing France apart. And in August of 1415, he landed in Normandy with about 12,000 men. His first target was the port city of Harfleur. It should have been a quick victory. Instead, the siege dragged on for weeks. Disease swept through the English camp. Dysentery. Fever. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry had lost nearly half his army to sickness. A wiser commander might have sailed home. The campaign season was ending. Winter was coming. The French were gathering a massive army to destroy him. But Henry V was not a man who turned back. He decided to march his weakened force across northern France to the English-held port of Calais. It was a gamble, perhaps the greatest gamble of his life. The French moved to cut him off. They gathered every knight, every noble, every man-at-arms they could find. By some estimates, they outnumbered Henry's army 5-1, maybe more. They blocked his path near a village called Agincourt, and they were confident. How could they lose? The English were exhausted, starving, riddled with disease. This would be easy. It was not easy. The battle took place on October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The field was narrow, hemmed in by dense woods on both sides. It had been raining for days. The ground was churned mud, thick and heavy. The French advanced on foot, their heavy armour sinking into the mire with every step. The English longbowmen waited, and when the French came within range, the arrows began to fall. It was Crécy again. It was Poitiers again, but somehow worse. The French could barely move. They could barely lift their arms to fight. Men fell and could not rise. Others tripped over the bodies and went down themselves. The mud became a death trap. Knights drowned in it, pushed face down by the weight of their own armour. The English archers dropped their bows and waded in with swords and axes. They killed men who could not defend themselves. They took prisoners when they could, because prisoners meant ransom. But at one point Henry ordered the prisoners killed, fearing a French counterattack. Hundreds of captured nobles were executed on the spot. By the end of the day, the French army had ceased to exist. The dead numbered in the thousands. the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, the Count of Nevers, the Constable of France, name after name after name. An entire generation of French leadership wiped out in a single afternoon. Henry V had won, and France had nothing left to stop him. Over the next 5 years, Henry conquered Normandy piece by piece. Caen fell, Falaise fell. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, held out for months before starvation forced its surrender. The English were methodical, thorough. They did not just win battles, they took control. They installed English governors, they made the conquered lands part of England. And the French could do nothing. The mad king sat in Paris, unaware of what was happening. The Armagnacs and Burgundians continued their civil war, even as the English swallowed their country. Neither side would make peace with the other. Neither side would unite against the common enemy. They hated each other too much. Then came the murder that sealed France's fate. In 1419, the Dauphin Charles, the Mad King's son and heir, agreed to meet with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. It was supposed to be a peace conference, a chance to end the civil war and face the English together. They met on a bridge at Montereau. Neutral ground, safe ground. It was not safe. During the meeting, one of the Dauphin's men attacked the Duke of Burgundy, an axe blow to the head. John the Fearless died on that bridge, murdered in what was supposed to be a negotiation. Whether the Dauphin ordered the killing or simply allowed it to happen, no one knows for certain, but it did not matter. The Burgundians blamed him, and they swore revenge. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, made his choice. He would ally with England. He would help Henry V destroy the Dauphin. He would see the murder of his father brought to ruin, even if it meant handing France to a foreign king. The Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420, and it gave Henry V everything he wanted. The mad King Charles VI agreed to disinherit his own son. He declared the Dauphin illegitimate. He adopted Henry V as his heir. When Charles VI died, Henry V would become King of France. The two crowns would unite. France would become English. To seal the deal, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. The wedding was held in the cathedral at Troyes. It was a grand affair, a celebration, the beginning of a new era. Except it was not. Henry V never became King of France. In August of 1422, he fell ill at the Château de Vincennes. Dysentery, probably. The same disease that had plagued his army since Harfleur. He was 35 years old. He had conquered a kingdom, and now he was dying. His last words, according to some accounts, were about Jerusalem. He had dreamed of leading a crusade, of taking the holy city. That dream would never come true. On August 31st, 1422, Henry V was dead. 7 weeks later, Charles VI followed him. The mad king finally found peace, dying on October 21st, 1422. He had ruled for 42 years. He had seen his kingdom torn apart by war, and his own mind torn apart by madness. Now it was over. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the crown of France should have passed to Henry's son, but that son was less than a year old, an infant. Henry VI, King of England, and supposedly King of France, a baby ruling two kingdoms through regents and councils. The Dauphin Charles refused to accept it. He was 20 years old. He had been declared illegitimate by his own father. Half of France was occupied by the English. The Burgundians wanted him dead, but he would not give up. He declared himself the true King of France. He set up his court at Bourges, south of the Loire River, and he waited. His enemies mocked him. The King of Bourges, they called him. The little king of a little kingdom. He had no money. He had few soldiers. He had lost battle after battle. Even his own mother had abandoned him, supporting the English claim. By 1428 his situation was desperate. The English were moving south. They had besieged the city of Orleans, the last major stronghold on the Loire. If Orleans fell, there would be nothing left to stop them. The Dauphin would be hunted down. The Treaty of Troyes would be fulfilled. France would cease to exist. And then in the darkest hour, a messenger arrived at the Dauphin's court, a young girl from a village no one had heard of. She said God had sent her. She said she would save France. No one believed her, not at first. The village of Domrémy sat in a river valley, surrounded by low hills and thick forests. It was a small place, maybe 50 families. The kind of village where everyone knew everyone else, where life followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting and harvest, birth and death, Sunday Mass and holy days. Joan was born there around 1412. We do not know the exact date. Peasants did not keep careful records of such things. But she was baptized in the village church, dedicated to Saint Remy, and given the name Jehanne, Joan in English. Her father was Jacques d'Arc, a farmer like most men in the village, but also something more. He served as a doyen, a kind of village headman. He collected taxes. He organised the night watch. He represented Domrémy in dealings with the local lord. He was not wealthy, but he was respected, a man of standing in a small community. Her mother was Isabelle Romet. The surname suggests a pilgrimage, perhaps to Rome, though we cannot be certain. She was a devout woman. She taught Joan to pray, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, the Credo. These were the prayers Joan knew by heart, the only formal education she ever received. Joan had siblings, 3 brothers, Jacquemin, Jean and Pierre, 1 sister, Catherine. She was not the oldest or the youngest, just one child among several, in a household that worked together to survive. The house still stands today, or at least a version of it. Stone walls, a thatched roof, a single large room where the family lived and slept. Animals kept in an attached stable, their warmth helping to heat the house in winter. It was modest, but it was solid. The D'Arc family was not poor. They had enough land to be comfortable, enough standing to matter in the village. Joan's childhood was ordinary. She learned to spin wool and flax. She helped tend the animals, sheep, pigs, the family's few cattle. She worked in the fields during busy seasons. She went to church. She said her prayers. The village priest later testified that she confessed her sins so often, he sometimes had to tell her to come back another time. She never learned to read. She never learned to write. This was not unusual. Most peasants were illiterate. Books were expensive, rare, and useless for farming. What mattered was knowing how to work, how to survive, how to pray. But Domrémy was not as isolated as it might seem. The village sat on a border. Technically, it belonged to the Duchy of Bar, which owed allegiance to the French crown. But just across the river lay Burgundian territory. The war was not some distant rumour. It was a daily reality. The village had been raided more than once. Joan later testified that when she was young, the family fled to the nearby town of Neufchâteau to escape an attack. They stayed there for several days, sheltering with a woman who ran an inn. When they returned, they found their church had been burned. The children of Domrémy knew which side they were on. They were Armagnac, loyal to the Dauphin. Across the river, the village of Maxey was Burgundian. The children of the 2 villages sometimes fought each other. Joan admitted later that she had seen boys from Domrémy come home bloodied from these skirmishes. She said she would gladly have seen the Burgundians' heads cut off, if it pleased God. This was not a peaceful childhood. This was a childhood shaped by war. But there was beauty too. The valley was green and fertile. The river ran clear. Near the village stood a great beech tree that the locals called the fairy tree. It was ancient, its branches spreading wide, shading a spring where clear water bubbled up from the earth. There were stories about that tree, old stories. People said that fairies had once danced there, that the tree had magical properties, that wishes made at the spring might come true. The village girls would go there sometimes, especially in spring. They would hang garlands on the branches. They would dance and sing. They would drink from the spring. Joan went there too. She admitted it at her trial, but she insisted she never did anything superstitious. She never saw fairies. She never made wishes. She just thought it was a beautiful tree, and she liked to walk in the woods. The judges at her trial would later try to use this against her. They wanted to prove she was involved in witchcraft, that her voices came from demons, not saints. The fairy tree was evidence, they said, proof of her dealings with dark powers. Joan denied it. Again and again, she denied it. She was a good Christian girl. She went to church. She said her prayers. She confessed her sins. Whatever happened at that tree, it was not witchcraft. And something did happen, not at the tree, but nearby, in her father's garden. On a summer day, around the year 1425, when Joan was about 13 years old, she was alone. It was noon or close to it. The sun was high, and suddenly there was a light, a voice, something she had never experienced before. She was frightened. She did not understand what was happening, but the voice spoke to her. It told her to be good, to go to church, to behave well. It was the beginning of everything. The first time it happened, Joan did not know what it was. A light, a voice, a presence she could not explain. She was in her father's garden, alone, in the middle of the day, and suddenly something was there with her. She was afraid. That was her first reaction. Fear. She was 13 years old, and something impossible was happening. The voice told her not to be afraid. It told her to be good, to go to church, to trust in God. And then it was gone. Joan did not tell anyone. What could she say? Who would believe her? She was a peasant girl. She had no education, no standing, no reason to think God would speak to her. So she kept it to herself. She prayed. She went to church. She waited to see if it would happen again. It did. The voice came back. Again and again. Sometimes in the garden, sometimes in the fields, sometimes when she was alone in the church praying before the altar. Always the same presence, always the same sense of light and warmth and something beyond the ordinary world. Over time, Joan began to understand what was happening, or at least she began to give it a shape she could comprehend. The voice was not just a voice, it was a saint, several saints actually. They came to her, they spoke to her, they told her things. The first was St. Michael, the archangel, the warrior of heaven who had cast Satan into the pit. He was a figure of immense importance in medieval France. His shrine at Mont Saint-Michel, on a rocky island off the coast of Normandy, had never fallen to the English. He was the protector of the kingdom, the champion of the faithful, and he was speaking to a peasant girl in a garden. Later, 2 other saints joined him, St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret of Antioch. Both were virgin martyrs, women who had died rather than renounce their faith or surrender their purity. They were popular saints in Joan's time. Their stories were told in churches across France. Catherine, who had debated pagan philosophers and won. Margaret, who had been swallowed by a dragon and burst free through the power of the cross. These were the voices Joan heard, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. They came to her frequently, sometimes every day. They spoke to her with tenderness and love. She called them her voices, her counsel. She said she wept when they left her. She longed for their return. What did they tell her? At first, simple things. Be good. Pray. Trust in God. The kind of advice any pious person might give. But gradually, the messages changed. They became specific. They became urgent. They became impossible. Go to France, the voices said. By this they meant the territory controlled by the Dauphin, the real France, the France that had not surrendered to the English. Raise the siege of Orléans, the voices said. The city was hundreds of miles away. Joan had never seen it. She knew nothing of military matters, but the voices were clear. She must go to Orléans. She must save it. Bring the Dauphin to Reims, the voices said. Reims was where French kings were crowned. It was deep in enemy territory, held by the Burgundians. But the voices insisted. The Dauphin must be anointed with holy oil. He must be made a true king, and Joan must make it happen. She resisted. Of course she resisted. She was nobody. She was a girl who could not read, who had never left her village, who knew nothing of war or politics, or the ways of the great. She told the voices she could not do what they asked. She told them they had made a mistake. They had not made a mistake. The voices were patient. They were persistent. They came to her for 4 years, repeating the same message. Go to France. Save Orléans. Crown the king. They told her she would lead soldiers. They told her she would win victories. They told her she would not last long. A year, maybe a little more, but that she must not be afraid. God would be with her. 4 years. Think about that. From the age of 13 to the age of 17, Joan carried this secret. She told no one, not her parents, not her brothers, not the village priest who heard her confessions. She went about her daily life, spinning, farming, praying, while inside her head, saints were telling her to save France. Why did she keep it secret? She knew what would happen if she told. Her father had already said, half joking, that if Joan ever ran off with soldiers, he would drown her himself. Her family would never understand. The village would think she was mad, or worse, possessed by demons. So she waited. She prayed. She listened to her voices and wondered how any of it could possibly come true. The military situation grew worse. The English tightened their grip on northern France. The Burgundians showed no sign of reconciling with the Dauphin, and in October of 1428 the English army laid siege to Orléans. Joan knew what this meant. Everyone knew. Orléans was the key. If it fell, the Loire Valley would be open. The Dauphin's last stronghold would be exposed. France would be finished. The voices grew more urgent. The time had come. Joan could wait no longer. She had to act. But how? She was a peasant girl. She could not simply walk up to the Dauphin and offer to save his kingdom. She needed help. She needed someone to take her seriously. She needed a way in. The voices gave her a name, Robert de Baudricourt. He was the captain of Vaucouleurs, a town about 10 miles from Domrémy. He was a royal official, loyal to the Dauphin. He had soldiers, he had connections. If Joan could convince him, he could send her to the Dauphin. It was not much of a plan, but it was all she had. In the early months of 1428, Joan approached a relative named Durand-Laxart. He was older than her, married to one of her cousins. She asked him to take her to Vaucouleurs. She told him she needed to see Robert de Baudricourt. She said it was important. Durand was sceptical, but Joan was persistent. She had a way of making people listen. Eventually, he agreed. He took her to Vaucouleurs. He brought her before the captain. It did not go well. Robert de Baudricourt was not a man who suffered fools. He was a soldier, a practical man. He had held Vaucouleurs for the Dauphin through years of war and uncertainty. He had no time for peasant girls with wild stories. When Joan appeared before him in May of 1428, she was wearing a simple red dress, the clothes of a farm girl. She was 16 years old. She had never been anywhere important, and she was telling him that God had sent her to save France. Baudricourt's response was blunt. He told Durand-Laxart to take her home. He told him to have her father give her a good slapping. He probably laughed. The interview was over in minutes. Joan went home, but she did not give up. The months passed. Summer turned to autumn. The English siege of Orléans began in October. News filtered back to Domrémy. The city was surrounded. The situation was desperate. The Dauphin had no army capable of breaking through. Joan's voices grew more insistent. She had to go. She had to act. The time was now. In January of 1429, she tried again. This time, she was more determined. She went back to Durand-Laxart and convinced him to take her to Vaucouleurs once more. But this time, she did not plan to leave until she got what she needed. She stayed in the town. She lodged with a wheelwright named Henri Leroyer and his wife. She attended Mass every day at the Church of St. Mary. She prayed, she waited, and she talked to anyone who would listen. Word spread. There was a girl in town who claimed God had sent her to save France. Some people laughed, others were curious. A few began to believe. 2 young men were among the first to take her seriously. Jean de Metz was a minor noble, a soldier who had seen enough of the war to be desperate for any hope. Bertrand de Poulengy was similar, a man of some standing who had grown weary of defeat after defeat. They met Joan, they talked to her, and something about her convinced them. Jean de Metz asked her directly, "When do you want to leave?" Joan's answer was immediate. Rather today than tomorrow, rather tomorrow than later. These 2 men would become her first true supporters. They pledged to escort her to the Dauphin themselves, with or without Baudricourt's permission. They believed her. They did not fully understand why, but something in her voice, in her certainty, in the calm way she spoke of impossible things, it moved them. Still, Baudricourt held back. He was not ready to stake his reputation on a peasant girl's visions. He needed more. He needed proof. Or at least, he needed to rule out the worst possibility. What if she was not sent by God? What if she was sent by the devil? This was a real concern in the 15th century. People believed in demons as firmly as they believed in saints. A young woman claiming divine visions could be a prophet, or she could be a witch. The difference was not always easy to see. Baudricourt sent for a priest, a man named Jean Fournier. His job was simple. Examine the girl. Determine if she was possessed by evil spirits. If she was, cast them out. If she was not, report back. The priest came to the house where Joan was staying. He wore his stole. He carried holy water. He spoke the words of exorcism, commanding any demons present to depart in the name of God. Joan knelt before him. She answered his questions calmly. She showed no sign of demonic influence, no convulsions, no cursing, no fleeing from the sacred words. She was just a girl, a pious girl, who went to church and said her prayers and believed that saints spoke to her. The priest reported back to Baudricourt. He found nothing evil in her. It was not proof that her visions were real, but it was proof that she was not a servant of Satan. For Baudricourt, it was enough to keep listening. Then something happened that changed everything. Joan made a prediction. She told Baudricourt that on a certain day the French would suffer a great defeat near Orléans. She said she knew this because her voices had told her. She said the Dauphin's situation would grow even more desperate, and she said that she was the only one who could help him. Baudricourt probably dismissed it, another wild claim from a girl who claimed to hear saints, but he remembered it. Days later, a messenger arrived from the south. The news was bad. On February 12, 1429, a French force had been destroyed at a place called Rouvray. They had been trying to intercept an English supply convoy carrying food for the troops besieging Orléans. Barrels of herring mostly. Lenten provisions. The French attacked. The English formed their wagons into a defensive circle, and when the battle was over, the French were scattered and beaten. They called it the Battle of the Herrings. It was a humiliating defeat. and it happened exactly when Joan said it would. Baudricourt was shaken. He was a practical man. He did not believe in miracles, but this girl had known. She had known before the messengers arrived. How was that possible? He still hesitated, but the people of Vaucouleurs did not. The townspeople had watched Joan for weeks. They had seen her pray, they had heard her speak, and now they had seen her prediction come true. They began to believe. More than believe, they began to act. They collected money. They bought her a horse. They purchased men's clothing, a tunic, hose, boots, a cloak. They gave her what she needed to make the journey. The common people of a small town, pooling their resources to send a peasant girl to save France. Joan cut her hair short. She dressed in the men's clothing. This was shocking. Women did not wear men's clothes. It was against custom. Some said it was against God's law, but Joan insisted. Her voices had told her to dress this way. It was safer for travel. It was necessary for what lay ahead. Baudricourt finally relented. He could not ignore what was happening. The people believed. The prediction had come true. And the situation was so desperate that even a long chance was better than no chance at all. He gave Joan a sword. He gave her a letter of introduction to the Dauphin. He assigned men to escort her, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, who had already pledged themselves, along with their servants and a royal messenger named Collet de Vienne. 7 people in all, a tiny group for such a dangerous journey. On February 23rd, 1429, they rode out of Vaucouleurs. It was evening. They left quietly, without fanfare. The journey ahead was over 300 miles, through territory crawling with English soldiers and Burgundian patrols. If they were caught, they would be killed, or worse. They travelled mostly at night. They avoided towns when they could. They forded rivers swollen with winter rain, the water icy and fast. They slept in fields and forests, always watching, always listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Joan never complained. The men who travelled with her later testified to this. She was tireless. She was calm. She seemed to have no fear. When they warned her of dangers ahead, she told them not to worry. God would protect them. The road would be clear. And it was. 11 days of travel through enemy territory, and they never encountered a single patrol. They were never stopped. They were never questioned. It was as if they were invisible. On March 4th, 1429, they reached the town of Chinon. The Dauphin's court was there, in the great castle overlooking the river. Joan had made it. Against all odds, she had made it. But reaching Chinon was only the beginning. Now she had to convince a prince to trust her. A prince who had been betrayed so many times, he trusted no one. A prince who was mocked by his enemies and doubted by his friends. A prince who was not even sure he was legitimate. Joan had 11 days to rest before her audience with the Dauphin. 11 days of waiting while the court debated whether to see her at all. Some advisers said she was a fraud. Others said she might be a witch. A few suggested that desperate times called for desperate measures. The Dauphin himself was curious. He had heard the stories. He knew about the prediction that had come true. And he was desperate enough to grasp at any hope, no matter how unlikely. On March 6th, 1429, Joan was summoned to the castle. She was about to meet the man she had come to save. The Château de Chinon was enormous, a sprawling fortress of stone walls and towers stretching along a rocky ridge above the Vienne River. It had been a royal residence for centuries. Kings had lived here. Decisions that shaped nations had been made within these walls. Now it was the last refuge of a prince who might never be king. Charles, the Dauphin, was 26 years old. He had spent most of his life in uncertainty. His father was mad. His mother had abandoned him. His enemies said he was illegitimate, not the true son of the king, but the product of his mother's affair with some unknown lover. The Treaty of Troyes had stripped him of his inheritance. Half of France was occupied by his enemies. The other half was slipping away. He was not an impressive figure. Thin, awkward. His legs were weak, perhaps from childhood illness. He walked with an odd gait. His face was plain, his nose too large, his eyes too small. He did not look like a king. He did not carry himself like a king. And deep down, he was not sure he deserved to be king. The doubts gnawed at him. What if his enemies were right? What if he really was illegitimate? What if God had abandoned France because the true royal line had been broken? These questions haunted him. He had even prayed about it, alone in his chapel, asking God to give him a sign, to tell him the truth about his birth. No one knew about that prayer. He had told no one. It was his secret between himself and God. Into this court of doubt and despair came Joan. She was brought to the great hall on the evening of March 6th. The room was vast, lit by dozens of torches. Hundreds of courtiers filled the space. Nobles, knights, officials, servants. Everyone wanted to see the peasant girl who claimed God had sent her. The Dauphin had prepared a test. He did not sit on the throne. Instead, he dressed plainly and hid among the crowd. Another man, richly dressed, took his place in the seat of honour. If this girl was truly sent by God, she would know the real Dauphin. If she was a fraud, she would be fooled by the decoy. Joan entered the hall. She was still wearing men's clothing. Her hair was still cut short. She looked nothing like a courtier, nothing like anyone who belonged in this place. The crowd watched. The room fell silent. She did not hesitate. She did not look at the man on the throne. She walked directly through the crowd, straight to where the Dauphin was standing, and knelt before him. "God give you life, gentle king," she said. Charles tried to deflect. He pointed to the man on the throne. "I am not the king," he said. "There is the king." Joan was not fooled. "In God's name, noble prince, it is you and no other." The court erupted in whispers. How had she known? She had never seen the Dauphin before. She had never been to court. Yet she walked straight to him, as if guided by an invisible hand. But Joan was not finished. She asked to speak with the Dauphin privately. Charles agreed. They stepped aside away from the crowd, where no one could hear them. What happened next, only Joan and Charles knew for certain. But later accounts suggest that Joan told him something that shook him to his core. She spoke of his secret prayer, the prayer he had made alone, asking God to confirm his legitimacy. She told him that God had heard, that he was the true heir, that his doubts were unfounded. Charles's face changed. Those who watched from a distance saw it. The anxiety that had clouded his features lifted. He looked different, lighter, as if a burden had been removed. When they returned to the court, Charles announced that he was inclined to believe the girl, but he was cautious. He had been fooled before. He needed more than one conversation to stake his kingdom on this stranger. He ordered an investigation. Joan was taken to the city of Poitiers, where a panel of theologians and scholars would examine her. They would question her about her visions. They would test her faith. They would determine whether she was sent by God, by the devil, or by her own imagination. The examination lasted 3 weeks. Day after day, learned men interrogated a peasant girl who could not read. They asked about her voices. They asked about her childhood. They asked about the fairy tree and the spring near Domrémy. They looked for signs of heresy, signs of witchcraft, signs of deception. Joan answered them with a mixture of simplicity and sharpness that surprised everyone. When they asked what language her voices spoke, she said, "Better than yours." The questioner had a strong regional accent. The room laughed. When they asked for a sign that she was truly sent by God, she refused. "I did not come to Poitiers to make signs," she said. "Take me to Orléans. I will show you the signs for which I was sent." When they asked why God needed soldiers to save France if he was all-powerful, she had a ready answer. "The soldiers will fight," she said, "and God will give the victory." She was also examined physically. Matrons inspected her to confirm that she was a virgin. This was important. In medieval thinking, a woman who consorted with demons could not remain a virgin. The devil required physical union with his servants. If Joan was pure, it was evidence that her visions came from heaven, not hell. The matrons confirmed it. Joan was a virgin, the maid they called her, la pucelle. At the end of 3 weeks, the theologians delivered their verdict. They had found nothing evil in Joan, nothing heretical, nothing suspicious. They could not say for certain that her visions were genuine, but they could say that, given the desperate circumstances, it would be wrong to reject her without giving her a chance. The Dauphin accepted their judgment. He would give Joan what she needed. She was fitted for armour, a full suit, custom-made, the kind worn by knights. She was given a household, attendants, heralds, pages. She was given a banner, designed according to her instructions. It showed Christ in judgment, flanked by 2 angels, with the words Jesus Maria inscribed on it. Joan said she loved her banner more than her sword. She carried it into battle herself, and she was given a sword, but not just any sword. Joan told the Dauphin's men that there was a sword buried behind the altar of the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois. She had never been to this church. She had no way of knowing what was there, but she was certain. The sword was there. They should go and find it. They went. They dug behind the altar, and they found a sword, old and rusted, buried in the earth. When they cleaned it, the rust fell away easily, as if by miracle. 5 crosses were engraved on the blade. Word of this spread quickly. The girl who knew the Dauphin on sight, the girl who passed every test, the girl who knew where a buried sword lay hidden. She was either a saint or a sorceress, and the theologians had ruled out sorceress. By late April, everything was ready. An army had been assembled. Supplies had been gathered. The relief of Orléans was about to begin. Joan rode at the head of the column, a peasant girl in knight's armour, carrying a banner she had designed, armed with the sword she had found through revelation. Behind her marched thousands of soldiers who, for the first time in years, believed they might actually win. The siege of Orléans had lasted 6 months. It was about to end. Orléans was dying. For 6 months, the English had tightened their grip around the city. They had built a ring of fortresses, bastilles they called them, on every side. Each bastille was a small fort, bristling with soldiers and cannons, blocking the roads and the river crossings. Nothing could get in. Nothing could get out. The city sat on the north bank of the Loire River. It was a prosperous place, or had been. About 30,000 people lived there. Merchants, craftsmen, priests, soldiers. Now they were all trapped together, watching their food supplies dwindle, wondering how much longer they could hold. The English did not need to storm the walls. They just had to wait. Starvation would do their work for them. The commander of the English forces was the Earl of Suffolk, a capable man, patient. He knew that time was on his side. Every week that passed meant less food in Orléans, less hope, less will to resist. Inside the city, the defence was led by Jean de Dunois. He was called the Bastard of Orléans, not an insult, just a statement of fact. He was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Orléans, who had been captured by the English years ago, and was still a prisoner. Dunois was a skilled commander. He had done everything possible to hold the city. But he was running out of options. The walls were strong. The defenders were brave. But bravery could not fill empty bellies. The people of Orléans were beginning to talk about surrender. Better to negotiate terms than to starve. Better to live under English rule than to die behind French walls. Dunois knew that if help did not come soon, the city would fall. And if Orléans fell, France would fall with it. Then the rumours started. A girl, a peasant girl from the east. She said God had sent her. She said she would save Orléans. She had convinced the Dauphin to give her an army. Some people laughed. A girl leading soldiers? It was absurd. Others were not so sure. Strange things happened in desperate times. Maybe God was finally answering their prayers. On April 29th, 1429, the rumours became reality. Joan arrived at Orléans in the evening. She came from the east across the river, entering through the Burgundy gate. With her came supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, and soldiers, fresh soldiers to reinforce the exhausted garrison. The people of Orléans poured into the streets to see her. They carried torches. They wept. They reached out to touch her horse, to touch her banner. After 6 months of despair, hope had arrived, and it had the face of a 17-year-old girl. Dunois met her at the gate. He had heard the stories. He was sceptical but willing to be convinced. What he saw surprised him. Joan was not what he expected. She was young, yes, inexperienced, certainly. But there was something about her, a calmness, a certainty. She spoke as if victory was already assured, as if the outcome was never in doubt. She was also angry. Joan had expected to attack the English immediately. Instead, Dunois had brought her into the city by a roundabout route, avoiding the main English positions. It was the safe approach, the sensible approach. Joan did not care about safe or sensible. "I bring you better help than ever came to any soldier or city," she told Dunois. "It is the help of the King of Heaven." Dunois tried to explain the military situation. The English positions were strong. A direct attack would be costly. They needed to wait for more reinforcements. Joan was not interested in waiting, but she was also disciplined. She did not launch a reckless attack on her own. She attended Mass. She prayed. She visited the defences and spoke with the soldiers. She sent a letter to the English commanders demanding that they withdraw. The letter was blunt. "You men of England, who have no right to this kingdom of France, the King of Heaven orders and commands you through me, Joan the Maid, to abandon your fortresses and go back to your own country. If you do not, I will make such a war cry as will be remembered forever." The English response was equally blunt. They called her names that cannot be repeated. They threatened to burn her as a witch. They laughed at the idea that a girl could threaten them. They would not be laughing for long. For 3 days, Joan waited. Reinforcements trickled in. The army grew stronger. The mood in the city shifted. Soldiers who had been demoralized for months began to believe again. They looked at this girl, in her white armour, carrying her strange banner, and they felt something they had not felt in a long time. Hope. On May 4th, the waiting ended. The French attacked an English position called Saint-Lô. It was a bastille on the eastern edge of the siege lines. The assault began without Joan. She was resting, exhausted from the days of travel and tension. But when she heard the sounds of battle, she grabbed her armour and rushed to join the fight. By the time she arrived, the attack was faltering. The English were holding. French soldiers were falling back. Then Joan appeared, on horseback, banner in hand, riding straight toward the enemy. The effect was electric. The French soldiers rallied. They surged forward. Within hours, Saint-Lô had fallen. It was the first English position to be captured in 6 months. Joan wept when she saw the dead, English and French alike. She was a warrior, but she was not heartless. She ordered priests to hear the confessions of the dying. She prayed for the souls of the fallen, even her enemies. That night, Orléans celebrated. The first victory. The first crack in the English siege. The Maid had done what she promised. But the siege was not broken yet. The strongest English positions remained, including the fortress that controlled the bridge into the city, a place called Les Tourelles. Joan knew what had to be done. The real battle was still to come. The morning of May 5th was quiet. Joan spent it in prayer. She knew what was coming. She knew the cost would be high. She confessed her sins. She attended Mass. She prepared herself for battle. The French commanders held a council of war. They debated strategy. They argued about which English position to attack next. They did not invite Joan. She was useful for morale, they thought, but actual military decisions should be left to professionals. Joan disagreed. When she learned that the commanders were meeting without her, she was furious. She confronted them directly. "You have been with your council," she said, "and I have been with mine. And believe me, the counsel of God will be accomplished, and will stand, and your counsel will perish." The commanders were taken aback. This girl was challenging their authority, telling them that God's plan mattered more than their experience. It was outrageous. It was also, they were beginning to suspect, possibly true. The next day, May 6th, the French attacked the Augustins. This was a fortified convent on the south bank of the Loire, just in front of Les Tourelles. To reach the main fortress, they had to take this position first. The assault was fierce. Joan was in the thick of it, her banner visible above the chaos, rallying soldiers who might otherwise have fallen back. The fighting lasted for hours. Men fell on both sides. The ground grew slick with blood. By evening the Augustins had fallen. The French held the south bank. Les Tourelles lay directly ahead, separated only by a narrow strip of ground and a deep ditch. That night, Joan made a prediction. Tomorrow, she said, she would be wounded. An arrow would strike her above the breast, but she would not die. She would keep fighting, and the English would be driven out. Some of the soldiers heard this and were afraid. If the maid was going to be wounded, maybe the attack would fail. Maybe they should wait. Maybe they should reconsider. Joan would not reconsider. At dawn on May 7th, the assault on Les Tourelles began. Les Tourelles was a formidable position. It was a stone gatehouse, originally built to control the bridge into Orléans. The English had fortified it heavily. They had dug ditches. They had built wooden palisades. They had positioned cannons and crossbows to sweep every approach. Taking it would be costly. The French attacked anyway. Wave after wave of soldiers rushed the walls. They carried scaling ladders. They tried to fill the ditches with bundles of sticks and debris. The English threw everything they had at them. Arrows, stones, boiling oil. Men screamed and fell. Others took their places. Joan was everywhere. She carried her banner into the most dangerous positions. She encouraged the soldiers. She shamed the cowards. She seemed to have no fear. Around midday, it happened. An arrow struck Joan above her left breast. It penetrated deep, 6 inches, some accounts say. She fell. Soldiers rushed to her side. They carried her away from the fighting. The wound was serious. Joan was in pain. She was frightened. She wept. Some accounts say she even had doubts in that moment, but she did not give up. Soldiers wanted to treat the wound with charms and spells, folk remedies that were common at the time. Joan refused. She would have nothing to do with magic. She allowed only olive oil and lard to be applied, and she prayed. The battle continued without her, but without Joan's presence the French attack began to falter. The soldiers had come to depend on her. When they could not see her banner, they lost heart. The assault stalled. Commanders began talking about withdrawal. Dunois made the decision. They would pull back. They would rest. They would try again tomorrow. Joan heard this and refused to accept it. She rose from where she had been resting. The arrow had been removed. The wound was bound. She was weak. She was in pain, but she put on her armour, she took up her banner, and she returned to the battlefield. The effect was immediate. Soldiers who had been retreating stopped. They turned. They saw the maid, wounded but unbowed, walking back toward the enemy. If she could keep fighting, so could they. Joan went to a quiet spot in a vineyard near the fortress. She prayed. Some say she was there for 15 minutes. Others say longer. When she returned, her face was set. Her voice was strong. "Watch," she told a soldier nearby. "When my banner touches the wall, the fortress will be yours." She advanced toward Les Tourelles. The French soldiers followed. They hit the walls with renewed fury. The English, who had thought the attack was over, scrambled to respond. Joan's banner touched the wall. The French surged over the defences. They poured into the fortress. The English line broke. Soldiers who had held firm all day suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. The English commander, a man named Glasdale, tried to retreat across a drawbridge to a secondary position, but the French had set fire to a barge beneath the bridge. The flames weakened the structure. As Glasdale crossed, the bridge collapsed. He fell into the river, dragged down by the weight of his armour. He drowned. By nightfall, Les Tourelles had fallen. The bridge into Orléans was open. The siege was broken. The next morning, May 8th, the remaining English forces assembled outside the city walls. They formed battle lines. They looked ready to fight. The French came out to meet them. For a long, tense hour, the two armies faced each other. No one moved. No one attacked. Joan ordered her soldiers not to strike first. It was Sunday. She would not start a battle on the Lord's Day. The English stood there, watching. They had seen what happened at Les Tourelles. They had seen the Maid wounded and rise again. They had seen their strongest position fall in a single day. They turned and marched away. The siege of Orléans was over. After 6 months, the English were gone. The city was free. Joan entered the city in triumph. The bells rang. The people cheered. They called her the Maid of Orléans. They said she was sent by God. And in that moment, it was hard to argue. In 9 days, Joan had accomplished what experienced commanders had failed to do for half a year. She had broken the siege. She had driven out the English. She had given France something it had not had in decades: hope. But Joan knew her work was not finished. The siege was lifted, but the Dauphin was not yet king. He had not been crowned. He had not been anointed with holy oil. Until that happened, he was still just a prince hiding in the south. Joan's voices had given her 2 tasks: raise the siege of Orléans, crown the king at Reims. One task was done, the other still lay ahead, and Reims was deep in enemy territory. Joan did not rest long after Orléans. She could not. Her voices urged her forward. The Dauphin must be crowned. Every day of delay was a day wasted. She rode to meet Charles at his castle in Loches. She found him celebrating the victory, but hesitant to move forward. His advisers were cautious. They wanted to consolidate gains. They wanted to negotiate with the Burgundians. They wanted to be safe. Joan had no patience for safe. "Noble Dauphin," she told him, "do not hold so many long councils. Come quickly to Reims to receive your crown." Charles hesitated. Reims was far away. The road passed through enemy territory. The English still held strong positions along the Loire. It was too dangerous. Joan pressed him. She reminded him that she would not last long. Her voices had told her she had a year, maybe a little more. There was no time for caution. There was only time for action. Eventually, Charles agreed. But first the remaining English positions on the Loire had to be cleared. The army could not march north with enemies at its back. Joan threw herself into the campaign. The first target was Jargeau, a fortified town east of Orléans, held by the Earl of Suffolk with a strong garrison. The French arrived on June 11th. The assault began the next day. It was brutal fighting. The English defended fiercely. Joan was in the thick of it, as always. At one point, she was climbing a scaling ladder when a stone struck her helmet. She fell to the ground. Soldiers rushed to help her. She got up. She kept fighting. "Forward, forward," she shouted. "The Lord has condemned the English. They are ours. Be of good heart." The French broke through. The town fell. The Earl of Suffolk was captured. Hundreds of English soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. 4 days later, the French attacked Meung-sur-Loire. They seized the bridge, cutting off the English garrison from reinforcement. They did not assault the main fortress. They did not need to. The bridge was what mattered. The next day, June 16th, they moved on to Beaugency. Another fortified town, another English garrison. This time, the defenders did not wait to be stormed. They saw what had happened at Jargeau. They knew what was coming. They negotiated a surrender and marched away. The Loire Valley was almost clear, but the English were not finished. A relief force was coming. Sir John Fastolfe, a veteran commander, was marching south with reinforcements. If he reached the English garrisons, the campaign would stall. The French had to stop him. On June 18th, the two armies met near a village called Patay. What happened at Patay was unlike anything that had come before. For nearly a century, English armies had dominated French forces in open battle. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. The pattern was always the same. English longbowmen would form a defensive line. French knights would charge. The arrows would fall. The French would die. Patay was different. The French cavalry caught the English before they could form up. The longbowmen were still preparing their positions, still planting the stakes that protected them from cavalry charges, when the French horsemen appeared. There was no time to prepare, no time to form the defensive line that had won so many battles. The French hit them at full gallop. It was a massacre. Over 2,000 English soldiers were killed. Sir John Talbot, one of England's most feared commanders, was captured. The army that was supposed to save the Loire garrisons was destroyed in less than an hour. Joan was present at Patay, though she arrived after the main fighting was over. The victory belonged to the French cavalry commanders, men like the Duke of Alençon and Jean de Dunois, but everyone knew that Joan had made it possible. She had transformed the army. She had given them confidence. She had shown them that the English could be beaten. After Patay, the road to Reims was open. The English were reeling. Their garrisons along the Loire were gone. Their relief force was destroyed. For the first time in decades, they were on the defensive. The French army gathered at Gien at the end of June. 12,000 soldiers, knights and men-at-arms, archers and foot soldiers. The largest French force assembled in years, and at its head a peasant girl in white armour. Charles finally committed. He would march to Reims. He would be crowned. Joan had convinced him. On June 29th, 1429, the army set out. The journey would take them through enemy territory, through towns that might resist or might surrender, through lands that had not seen a French army in years. No one knew what would happen, but Joan was certain. God would provide. The road would be clear. The king would be crowned. She had been right about everything so far. The road to Reims stretched over 150 miles. Every step took the army deeper into hostile territory. Towns along the route were held by Burgundians or English sympathisers. Any one of them could resist. Any one of them could slow the march long enough for the enemy to respond. Joan was not worried. She never seemed worried. She rode at the head of the column, her banner flying, as if she were leading a parade rather than an invasion. The first test came at Auxerre, a prosperous city with strong walls. The garrison was Burgundian. They could have resisted. They could have forced a siege that would have cost precious time. Instead, they negotiated. The city would not open its gates, but it would not fight either. It would provide supplies. It would let the army pass, and if other cities along the route submitted to the Dauphin, Auxerre would consider doing the same. It was a compromise. Joan did not like compromises. She wanted to attack. She wanted to take the city and show the world that nothing could stand in their way. But the Dauphin's advisers counselled patience. They accepted the deal. The army moved on. The next city was Troyes. This was different. This was personal. Troyes was where the treaty had been signed. The Treaty of Troyes, the document that had disinherited the Dauphin and given France to the English king. The shame of 1420 had happened within these walls. Taking Troyes would erase that shame. But Troyes was also strongly fortified. The garrison was prepared to resist. The city's leaders sent word that they would not surrender. They would fight. The French army arrived on July 4th. They made camp outside the walls. Days passed. The army supplies began to run low. Some of the Dauphin's advisers grew nervous. They talked about turning back. They said the campaign had gone far enough. They said it was foolish to risk everything on a single city. Joan had heard enough. She went to the Dauphin. She told him to be patient. She told him that Troyes would fall within 2 days. She asked for permission to assault the walls. Charles hesitated. He always hesitated, but he gave her permission. Joan went to work. She ordered the soldiers to prepare for an attack. They gathered bundles of sticks and branches to fill the moat. They brought up ladders. They positioned themselves around the walls. The people of Troyes watched from the ramparts. They saw the preparations, they saw the army massing, and they saw Joan riding back and forth, directing everything. Her banner snapping in the wind. They had heard the stories. They knew what had happened at Orléans. They knew what had happened at Jargeau and Patay. This girl had never lost a battle. She seemed to be protected by God himself. The city's leaders called a council. They debated, they argued, and then they sent a message to the Dauphin. They would surrender. On July 10th, 1429, the gates of Troyes opened. The Dauphin entered the city where his disinheritance had been signed. The shame of 1420 was washed away. The pattern repeated itself. Town after town opened its gates. Châlons-en-Champagne sent a delegation to meet the army on the road. They did not even wait for the French to arrive. They simply surrendered. The news spread ahead of the army. The Maid was coming. The Maid who had broken the siege of Orléans. The Maid who had never been defeated. Resistance seemed pointless. God was clearly on her side. On July 16th, the army reached Reims, the city that had crowned French kings for centuries. The city where Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, had been baptized over 900 years before. The most sacred place in the kingdom. The gates were open. The people were waiting. They lined the streets, cheering, weeping, throwing flowers. The Dauphin rode through crowds that had not seen a French prince in years. Behind him came Joan, her mission almost complete. That night, the city prepared for the coronation. The sacred oil was retrieved from the Abbey of Saint-Rémy. The regalia was gathered. The cathedral was made ready. Joan's family was there. Her father, Jacques, had travelled from Domrémy to see this moment. Her brothers had come too, the peasant family from a village no one had heard of, standing in the greatest cathedral in France, watching their daughter change history. Joan found a quiet moment to speak with her father. We do not know what they said. Perhaps she apologized for leaving without his blessing. Perhaps he apologized for threatening to drown her. Perhaps they simply embraced, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The next morning, the coronation would take place. The Dauphin would become a king, and Joan's impossible mission would be. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Reims was one of the great wonders of the Christian world. Its towers rose 250 feet into the sky. Its facade was covered with hundreds of stone statues, kings and saints and angels, all watching over the entrance. Inside, the nave stretched toward the altar, lit by enormous stained glass windows that turned sunlight into rivers of colour. This was where French kings were made, not born, made. Because in medieval France a king was not truly a king until he had been anointed with holy oil in this sacred place. The oil was special. According to legend, it had been brought from heaven by a dove at the baptism of Clovis in the year 496. It was kept in a sacred vessel called the Holy Ampulla, stored at the nearby abbey of Saint-Rémy. For over 900 years, every French king had been anointed with oil from that same vessel. Without the anointing, a king was just a man with a crown. With it, he was God's chosen representative on earth. The sacred oil transformed him. It gave him a divine mandate that no treaty could take away. This was why Reims mattered. This was why Joan had insisted on bringing the Dauphin here, through enemy territory, past fortified cities, across 150 miles of danger. The Treaty of Troyes meant nothing if Charles was anointed at Reims. The English could call him illegitimate. The Burgundians could call him a pretender. But once the holy oil touched his forehead, he would be the true King of France in the eyes of God and man. The ceremony took place on July 17th, 1429. A Sunday. The cathedral was packed with nobles, clergy, soldiers, and citizens. Everyone who could fit inside the great church was there. Thousands more waited outside, straining to hear the bells that would announce the moment. The Dauphin processed into the cathedral in his royal robes. He walked slowly, solemnly, toward the altar where the Archbishop of Reims waited. The choir sang. Incense filled the air. The light through the windows painted everything in shades of blue and gold and red. Joan was there. She stood near the altar holding her banner. The banner she had carried at Orléans. The banner she had carried at Jargeau and Patay. The banner that had touched the walls of Les Tourelles at the moment of victory. She had insisted on bringing it. When someone later asked her why the banner was given such a place of honour, she had a simple answer. It had shared in the toil. It was right that it share in the honour. The ceremony followed the ancient forms. The Dauphin knelt before the Archbishop. He swore oaths to protect the Church and the people of France. The holy oil was taken from the sacred ampulla and applied to his forehead, his chest, his shoulders, his arms. Each anointing was accompanied by prayers. Then came the crown. The Archbishop lifted it high so all could see and placed it on the Dauphin's head. He was no longer the Dauphin. He was Charles VII, King of France. The cathedral erupted. Cheers and weeping and cries of "Noel, Noel!" the traditional French acclamation for a king. The bells began to ring, and the sound spread across the city, across the countryside, carrying the news to everyone within earshot. France had a king again, a real king, anointed and crowned in the proper place, in the proper way, by the proper authority. Joan watched it all, and when the ceremony was complete, she did something unexpected. She knelt before the new king, she embraced his knees, and she wept. "Gentle king," she said, "now is accomplished the pleasure of God, who wished that I should raise the siege of Orléans and bring you to this city of Reims to receive your holy anointing, showing that you are the true king, and that the kingdom of France belongs to you." These were not the words of a military commander. These were the words of someone whose mission was complete, someone who had done what God asked and could finally rest. Charles raised her up. He was moved. Everyone was moved. The peasant girl who had made this possible, weeping at the feet of the king she had crowned. In the days that followed, honours were bestowed. Joan's family was ennobled. They were given a coat of arms, a blue shield with a golden sword supporting a crown, flanked by 2 fleurs-de-lis. They were exempted from taxes forever. The village of Domrémy and the neighbouring village of Rouen were also exempted, in honour of the maid who had come from there. Joan herself was given the right to add du lis to her name, Joan of the Lily. It was a mark of royal favour, associating her with the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of French kingship. But Joan seemed less interested in honours than in action. Even in the midst of celebration, she was thinking about what came next. Paris was still in English hands. The Burgundians were still enemies. The war was not over. She reportedly told the king that she would not last much longer. Her voices had warned her. She had perhaps a year, maybe less. There was still so much to do. Charles was less urgent. He had what he wanted. He was king now, properly crowned, properly anointed. He could negotiate from a position of strength. He could take his time. This difference between Joan's urgency and Charles's caution would define the months to come, and it would ultimately lead to tragedy. But for now, on this day in July, none of that mattered. The cathedral bells were ringing. The crowds were cheering. A peasant girl had done the impossible. She had crowned a king. The days after the coronation should have been a time of celebration, and they were for most people. But Joan could not celebrate, not fully, not while so much remained undone. Paris, the capital, the greatest city in France. It was still in English hands. The Burgundians still held it. The people there had not seen their true king in years. Joan wanted to march on Paris immediately, strike while the momentum was strong, take the city and end the war. Charles was not so sure. His advisers counselled caution. The army was tired. Supplies were low. The Burgundians were making diplomatic overtures. Perhaps a negotiated peace was possible. Perhaps more fighting was unnecessary. Charles listened to his advisers. He had always listened to his advisers. Even now, as a crowned king, he was not a man of decisive action. He preferred to wait, to see how things developed, to avoid risk. Joan found this maddening. She had not come this far to stop. Her voices had not guided her through enemy territory, through battles and wounds and impossible odds, just to watch the king negotiate with traitors. The Burgundians had allied with the English. They had helped disinherit Charles. They had occupied French cities and killed French soldiers. And now the king wanted to talk to them? But Joan was not the king. She was a soldier in his service. She could advise, she could urge, she could not command. The army moved slowly through the Île-de-France, the region around Paris. Towns submitted. Some opened their gates willingly. Others negotiated brief surrenders. But there was no clear direction. No decisive campaign. Just a slow drift toward the capital, without any real commitment to take it. The Burgundians played for time. They sent ambassadors. They made promises. They talked about truces and treaties and peaceful solutions. And all the while, they strengthened their defences. They brought in reinforcements. They prepared for the attack they knew was coming. Charles believed them, or wanted to believe them. A negotiated peace would be easier than more fighting. It would be safer. It would let him consolidate his gains without risking everything on another battle. Joan did not believe them. She knew the Burgundians were stalling. She knew every day of delay made the enemy stronger and the French weaker. But she could not make the king see it. August passed. The army inched closer to Paris. Joan grew more frustrated. She wrote letters urging action. She spoke to anyone who would listen. She begged the king to let her attack. Finally, in early September, Charles relented, partially. He allowed Joan to lead an assault on Paris, but he did not commit fully. He did not bring the whole army. He did not come himself. He gave her permission, but not support. On September 8, 1429, Joan attacked the Saint-Honoré Gate. It was a feast day, the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. Joan probably should not have attacked on such a holy day, but she was desperate. She'd waited too long already. She could not wait any longer. The assault was fierce. Joan led from the front, as always. She reached the outer defences. She stood in the dry moat before the walls, calling for the defenders to surrender, urging her soldiers forward. Then an arrow struck her. It hit her in the thigh. A crossbow bolt punching through her armour deep into the flesh, she fell. Soldiers rushed to help her. They tried to carry her away from the fighting. Joan refused to leave. She stayed in the moat, wounded and bleeding, still shouting encouragement to her troops. She believed they could take the gate. She believed victory was close. But the attack was failing. The defences were too strong. The French soldiers were exhausted. Without reinforcements, without the full weight of the royal army, they could not break through. As darkness fell, the Duke of Alençon came to retrieve Joan. He practically dragged her away from the walls. The assault was over. Paris had held. Joan wanted to try again the next day. She begged for another chance. She said she would take the city if they would just let her try. The king said no. Charles ordered the army to withdraw. He had seen enough. The attack had failed. It was time to negotiate, not fight. He pulled the army back from Paris and retreated toward the Loire. Joan was devastated. This was her first real defeat, not just a military setback, but a political one. The king had overruled her. He had chosen diplomacy over war. He had listened to his cautious advisers instead of the girl who had crowned him. Something broke in that moment. Not Joan's faith, not her belief in her mission, but her relationship with the king, her influence at court, her ability to shape events. She was still honoured, still respected, still called the Maid of Orléans, but she was no longer driving the strategy. She was no longer the voice that mattered most. The autumn of 1429 was difficult. The army was disbanded. The soldiers went home. Joan remained at court, but without a clear purpose. She participated in minor operations. She helped capture a few small towns. But there was nothing like the great campaigns of the spring and summer. In November, she led an assault on Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier. The attack nearly failed. The soldiers were falling back. Joan stood almost alone before the walls, refusing to retreat. When asked what she was doing, she said she had 50,000 soldiers with her. She meant her voices, her saints, the heavenly army that only she could see. The soldiers rallied. They took the town. It was a small victory, a reminder of what Joan could do. But it changed nothing. The winter passed. Christmas came and went. Joan waited for spring, for new campaigns, for a chance to finish what she had started. But the war had changed. The momentum was gone. The English and Burgundians had recovered from their shock. They were ready now, ready for the Maid. And Joan's time was running out. Spring came late in 1430. The roads were muddy. The rivers were swollen. But Joan could not wait any longer. Her voices were urgent. Time was short. She had spent the winter in frustration. The king was still negotiating with the Burgundians. Truces were signed and broken. Promises were made and forgotten. Nothing was resolved. The war dragged on without direction. Joan decided to act on her own. In March, she left the royal court without clear authorization. She gathered a small force, a few hundred soldiers, loyal men who still believed in her, and she rode north, toward the fighting. The Burgundians were besieging Compiègne. It was a town on the Oise River, northeast of Paris. It had declared for Charles VII after the coronation. Now the Burgundians wanted it back. Compiègne was important. If it fell, the Burgundians would control the river crossings. They would threaten the gains of the previous year. They would show that the tide had turned against the French. Joan could not let that happen. She arrived at Compiègne in late May. The townspeople welcomed her. They remembered what she had done at Orléans. They believed she could save them too. But the situation was different now. The Burgundian army was large, well supplied, well commanded, and they were expecting her. Joan spent a few days in the town. She assessed the defences. She spoke with the garrison. She planned a sortie, A quick attack on the Burgundian siege lines. Hit them hard. Disrupt their operations. Show them that Compiègne would not fall without a fight. On May 23rd, 1430, she led her soldiers out of the town. The attack began well. Joan's forces struck the Burgundian positions with speed and fury. They drove the enemy back. For a moment, it looked like another victory. Then everything went wrong. Burgundian reinforcements arrived. Fresh troops pouring in from nearby positions. The French advance stalled. The momentum shifted. Joan's soldiers began to fall back toward the town. Joan stayed in the rear. She always stayed in the rear during retreats. She covered her soldiers. She made sure everyone got back safely. It was what a good commander did. But this time she stayed too long. The Burgundians pressed forward. The French retreat became a scramble. Soldiers rushed toward the town gates, desperate to reach safety. The drawbridge was crowded. The gateway was jammed. And then the drawbridge rose. The captain of Compiègne, a man named Guillaume de Flavy, ordered the bridge raised and the gates closed. He said later that he had no choice. The Burgundians were too close. If he kept the gates open, they would pour into the town. He had to protect Compiègne. Joan was still outside. She was trapped in the fields before the walls, surrounded by enemies. She fought. Of course she fought. She was Joan of Arc. She did not surrender easily. But there were too many of them. A Burgundian archer grabbed her cloak and pulled her from her horse. She fell to the ground. Soldiers swarmed over her. Joan of Arc was a prisoner. The news spread like wildfire. The maid had been captured. The girl who had never lost a battle, who had crowned a king, who had seemed invincible. She was in enemy hands. The Burgundians were exultant. This was better than winning a battle. This was a symbol. Proof that God had abandoned the French cause. Proof that Joan was not what she claimed to be. She was taken to the camp of John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian nobleman. He was the one who had captured her technically. She was his prisoner now, his property. In medieval warfare, capturing an enemy was a business transaction. Prisoners were ransomed. The more important the prisoner, the higher the price. Joan was the most important prisoner anyone had taken in years. She was worth a fortune. John of Luxembourg was in no hurry to sell. He kept Joan in comfortable captivity while he considered his options. The French might pay to get her back. The English might pay even more to get their hands on her. Charles VII did nothing. The king who owed his crown to Joan made no effort to rescue her. He offered no ransom. He sent no army. He simply waited, as if she no longer mattered, as if she had served her purpose and could now be discarded. Historians have debated his inaction for centuries. Was he ungrateful? Cowardly? Did his advisers convince him that Joan was a liability now? Did he secretly want her gone? We will never know for certain. But the fact remains, Charles VII abandoned Joan of Arc. The English were not so passive. They wanted Joan. They wanted her badly. Not to ransom, not to release. They wanted to destroy her. If Joan was a saint, sent by God to save France, then the English cause was damned. Every victory she had won was proof of divine favour for the French. Every battle she had fought was a judgment against England. But if Joan was a witch, if she was a heretic, a servant of Satan, then everything changed. Her victories were not miracles but sorcery. Her voices were not saints but demons, and her execution would prove that God was on England's side after all. The English offered 10,000 livres for Joan, a king's ransom, enough money to tempt anyone. John of Luxembourg hesitated. He was Burgundian, not English. Selling Joan to the English meant sending her to her death. Even he had qualms about that. But the English were insistent, and the money was very good. In November 1430, after months of negotiation, the deal was done. Joan was sold to the English. She was transferred to their custody, and taken to Rouen, the capital of English-occupied Normandy. She would never leave. Rouen was an English city now. It had been the capital of Normandy for centuries, a proud French city with a great cathedral and ancient walls. But the English had held it for over a decade. English soldiers walked its streets. English officials ran its government. English law was the only law that mattered. This was where Joan would be tried. The trial was not about justice. Everyone involved knew that. The English wanted Joan dead. They wanted her declared a heretic and burned at the stake. The trial was simply the mechanism to make that happen. But it had to look legitimate. It had to follow proper procedures. The church was involved, and the church had rules. If the trial was too obviously a sham, it would backfire. Joan would become a martyr. Her death would strengthen the French cause instead of destroying it. So they were careful. They assembled a court. They gathered evidence. They followed the forms of ecclesiastical law, even as they bent it to their purposes. The man in charge was Pierre Cauchon. He was the Bishop of Beauvais, a French cleric who had sided with the Burgundians and the English. He had lost his diocese when the French recaptured the region. He blamed Joan for his misfortune. He wanted revenge. Cauchon was intelligent, ambitious, ruthless. He understood what the English wanted, and he was willing to deliver it. But he also understood that the trial had to appear fair. He assembled a panel of judges, theologians, lawyers, church officials. Over 100 men would participate at various points. It was an impressive display of ecclesiastical authority. Joan faced them alone. She had no lawyer, no advocate, no one to defend her or advise her. This was technically legal under church law. In heresy trials, the accused was expected to speak for themselves, but it meant that a 19-year-old peasant girl with no education and no legal training had to face some of the most learned men in France. The trial began on January 9th, 1431. Joan was brought from her cell in the castle to a chapel where the court had assembled. She was wearing men's clothing, the same type of clothing she had worn since Vaucouleurs. She was thin. She was pale. Months of imprisonment had taken their toll, but she was not broken. The questioning began immediately. They asked about her childhood, her visions, her voices. They asked about the fairy tree near Domrémy. They asked about her clothing. They asked about everything, looking for any crack they could exploit. Joan answered carefully. She was shrewd, despite her lack of education. She understood that they were trying to trap her. She gave them as little as possible. When they asked if she was in a state of grace, a trick question, since claiming certainty of salvation was considered presumptuous, while denying it was an admission of sin, Joan gave an answer that stunned the court. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The notary recording the proceedings noted that the judges were stupefied by her response. It was theologically perfect. A trained scholar could not have done better. But Joan could not parry every thrust. The questioning went on for weeks, session after session, hour after hour. They wore her down with a repetition. They asked the same questions in different ways, hoping she would contradict herself. The main charges centred on her voices. Joan insisted that St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret spoke to her. She insisted they came from God. She insisted she had to obey them. The judges said this was impossible. How could she know the voices were from God? How could she be certain they were not demons in disguise? The devil was cunning. He could appear as an angel of light. Only the church could determine whether visions were divine or diabolical. By trusting her own judgment over the church's authority, Joan was guilty of heresy. It was a trap with no escape. If Joan admitted her voices might be false, she would be confessing to fraud. Everything she had done would be discredited, but if she insisted her voices were true, without submitting to the church's judgment, she was placing herself above the church. That was heresy. Joan tried to navigate between these options. She said she would submit to the church, but only if the church did not ask her to deny what she knew to be true. She said she trusted God more than any earthly authority. She said she could not betray her voices, even to save her life. The judges pressed harder. They threatened her with torture. They showed her the instruments. They described what would happen to her body if she did not confess. Joan did not break. Truly, if you were to tear me limb from limb and drive the soul from my body, I would say nothing different. And if I did say something different, afterward I would always say that you had made me say it by force. They did not torture her. Perhaps they feared she would die before they could burn her. Perhaps they worried that a confession extracted by torture would be seen as invalid. Whatever the reason, they backed down. But they had other weapons. The clothing became the focus. Joan was still wearing men's clothes. She had worn them throughout her captivity, despite repeated orders to change. She said she needed them for protection. In prison, surrounded by male guards, the complicated fastenings of men's clothing made it harder for anyone to assault her. She said her voices had not given her permission to change. The judges said this was a sin. The Bible forbade women from wearing men's clothing. It was an abomination. By persisting in this sin, Joan proved she was unrepentant. She proved she was a heretic. On May 24th, 1431, they brought Joan to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen next to the church. A platform had been erected. A crowd had gathered. The executioner was waiting with his cart, ready to take her to the stake. They gave her one last chance. A document was read aloud. A confession, an abjuration, a promise to submit to the church and never wear men's clothing again. If she signed it, she would be spared the fire. She would be sentenced to life in prison instead. Joan was exhausted. She was frightened. She had been in prison for nearly a year. She was 19 years old, and she was about to be burned alive. She signed, or rather, she made a mark. She could not write, but she made a mark on the document, and it was accepted as her signature. The crowd was disappointed. They had come to see a burning. Instead, they saw a broken girl being led back to prison. The English soldiers were furious. They felt cheated. Some of them threw stones at the judges, but the judges knew what they were doing. They knew Joan would not stay broken for long. 3 days later, Joan was found wearing men's clothing again. The guards claimed she had put them on voluntarily. Joan said the guards had taken her women's clothes and left her nothing else to wear. She said they had tried to assault her. She said she had no choice. It did not matter what really happened. The judges had what they needed. Joan had relapsed. She had returned to her sin. A relapsed heretic could not be given another chance. The penalty was death. On May 29th, 1431, the court delivered its final verdict. Joan was a relapsed heretic. She was to be handed over to the secular authorities for execution. The burning would take place the next day. The morning was grey. Clouds hung low over Rouen, threatening rain that never came. The streets were crowded. People had come from across the city, from the surrounding countryside, to witness the burning of the witch. That was what they called her now. The witch, the heretic, the false prophet who had deceived a kingdom. The English had worked hard to spread this message. Joan was not a saint. She was a servant of Satan. Her death would prove it. The execution was set for the Place du Vieux Marché, the old market square in the heart of Rouen. A wooden platform had been built there, high enough for everyone to see. On the platform stood a pillar. Around the pillar, bundles of wood had been stacked. Everything was ready. Joan was brought from her cell early in the morning. She had spent the night in prayer. She had confessed her sins. She had asked for communion, and after some debate, the judges had allowed it. Even now, they were not entirely sure of themselves. Even now, they worried about what they were doing. She was dressed in a long white garment. Her head had been shaved. She looked small, fragile, nothing like the warrior who had led armies and crowned a king. They put her in a cart and drove her through the streets. The crowds pressed close. Some jeered, some wept, some simply stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. Joan wept too. She called out to the saints. She called out to God. She asked the people to pray for her. She forgave her enemies, even the judges, even the English, even Bishop Cochon, who rode alongside the cart watching. At the square, she was helped down from the cart and led to the platform. She climbed the steps slowly. Her legs were weak. She had to be supported. On the platform, she was shown a sign that had been prepared. It listed her crimes. Joan, who called herself the maid liar, pernicious deceiver of the people, sorceress, superstitious, blasphemer of God, presumptuous, misbeliever in the faith of Christ, boaster, idolater, cruel, dissolute, invoker of demons, apostate, schismatic, and heretic. Every word was a lie. Joan knew it. The judges knew it. But the words were there, for everyone to see. She was tied to the pillar. The ropes were tight around her body. She could not move. She could only wait. A Dominican friar named Martin Ladvenu stayed with her. He had been kind to her during the trial. He had heard her confession that morning. Now he stood beside her, holding a crucifix where she could see it. Joan asked him to hold it higher. She wanted it to be the last thing she saw. The executioner lit the fire. The wood was dry. It caught quickly. Smoke began to rise. The flames spread, climbing higher, reaching toward the platform where Joan stood. She began to pray, the Lord's Prayer, the names of the saints. Over and over, she called out to Jesus. Jesus! 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 The smoke thickened. The flames grew. The heat became unbearable. The crowd fell silent. Even those who'd come to mock found themselves unable to speak. Joan's voice grew weaker, but she kept praying. She kept calling out until the very end. The last word she spoke was Jesus. And then she was gone. The fire burned for a long time. The executioner had been ordered to make sure nothing remained. When the flames finally died down, he raked through the ashes. He found her heart. It had not burned. He tried again, adding more fuel, more fire. Still it would not burn. He was frightened. He gathered the ashes and the heart and threw them into the Seine River. Nothing of Joan would remain. Nothing that could become a relic. Nothing that could be venerated. But something remained anyway. Something that could not be burned or drowned or scattered. Her memory. The crowd dispersed slowly. Many were shaken by what they had witnessed. An English soldier who had brought a bundle of sticks to add to the fire was seen weeping afterward. He said he had seen a white dove fly from Joan's mouth at the moment of her death. He said he had seen the name of Jesus written in the flames. Others reported similar visions. A dove, a light, something miraculous at the moment of death. Were these stories true? Or were they the inventions of troubled minds, trying to make sense of what they had seen? We cannot know, but the stories spread. They became part of Joan's legend. John Tressart, one of the secretaries to the English king, was heard to say, "We are lost, we have burned a saint." Even those who had condemned her were not at peace. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, the great-uncle of the English king, had watched the execution from a window overlooking the square. He was seen weeping. Whether from guilt or relief, or something else entirely, no one could say. Bishop Cochon showed no such emotion. He had done what the English wanted. He expected his reward. He would receive it, promotions, wealth, power. But his name would be cursed for centuries. He would be remembered as the man who murdered Joan of Arc. The executioner was the most troubled of all. His name was Geoffroy Tirage. That night he went to Martin Ladvenu, the friar who had comforted Joan in her final moments. He confessed that he was terrified. He said he had burned a holy woman. He said he feared he would never be forgiven. Ladvenu tried to comfort him. He told him to seek God's mercy. He told him to pray. But Geoffroy Tirage would carry that burden for the rest of his life. He had been the instrument of Joan's death. The flames had come from his hands. Joan was 19 years old. She had been a public figure for barely 2 years. In that time she had lifted the siege of Orléans, won a string of military victories, and crowned a king. She had changed the course of a war that had lasted nearly a century. And now she was dead, burned as a heretic in a market square, her ashes floating down the Seine toward the sea. The English celebrated. They had destroyed the witch. They had proven that God was on their side. The French would lose heart. The war would turn in England's favour. They were wrong. Joan's death did not break the French spirit. It strengthened it. She became a martyr, a symbol, something to fight for. The girl who had given everything for France, betrayed by those she had served, murdered by those she had defeated. The war continued, but the momentum had shifted. The English would never recover what they had lost. The victories Joan had won could not be undone. The king she had crowned would not be uncrowned. Charles VII remained on his throne. He did not rescue Joan. He did not ransom her. He did not even try. But he benefited from everything she had done. And in the years to come, he would slowly, steadily push the English out of France. It would take another 22 years. The 100 Years' War would not end until 1453, when the last English army was defeated at the Battle of Castillon. But the turning point had come in 1429. The turning point had come with Joan. She did not live to see the final victory. She did not live to see the English driven from French soil. She did not live to see the kingdom she had saved become whole again. But she had made it possible. Every victory that came after, every battle won, every city reclaimed, all of it traced back to a peasant girl who heard voices in her father's garden. The fire in Rouen could not destroy that. Nothing could. 25 years passed. The war ended. The English were gone. Charles VII ruled a united France, just as Joan had promised. The kingdom she had saved was whole again. But Joan was still a condemned heretic. Her name was still blackened. The verdict of the Rouen trial still stood. In the eyes of the church, she had died a servant of Satan. This troubled many people. It troubled the king, who owed his crown to a woman the church called a witch. It troubled Joan's family, who had watched their daughter become a legend, and then a criminal. It troubled the people of France, who venerated Joan as a saint, even though the church said she was damned. Something had to be done. In 1449, Charles VII recaptured Rouen. The city where Joan had been tried and burned was French again. The king ordered an investigation into the trial. He wanted to know what had really happened. He wanted to know if Joan had been treated justly. The investigation took years. Witnesses were interviewed, documents were examined, the full record of the original trial was studied line by line. What they found was damning. The trial had been rigged from the beginning. The judges had been biased. The procedures had been violated. Joan had been denied the right to appeal to the Pope. She had been held in a secular prison, guarded by male soldiers, instead of a church prison guarded by women, as church law required. The abjuration document she had signed was not the same document that was read aloud to her. She had been tricked. Bishop Cauchon had manipulated everything. He had suppressed evidence that favoured Joan. He had coached witnesses. He had threatened anyone who tried to help her. The trial was not a search for truth. It was an assassination dressed in legal robes. In 1456 a new trial was convened. This one was called the trial of rehabilitation, or the trial of nullification. Its purpose was not to retry Joan, she was long dead, but to examine whether the original verdict was valid. The court heard from over 100 witnesses, people who had known Joan in Domrémy, people who had fought beside her at Orléans, people who had been present at her trial and execution. Their testimonies painted a picture very different from the one the English had presented. Joan was not a witch, she was not a heretic. She was a pious girl who had done extraordinary things. She had been murdered by her enemies under the cover of church authority. On July 7, 1456, the court delivered its verdict. The original trial was declared null and void. Every charge against Joan was thrown out. Her name was cleared. It was justice, late justice, justice that could not bring her back or undo her suffering, but justice nonetheless. Joan's mother, Isabel, was still alive. She was in her 70s now. She had spent decades fighting to clear her daughter's name. She was present when the verdict was announced. She wept. The rehabilitation changed Joan's status in the eyes of the church. She was no longer a condemned heretic. She was a faithful daughter of the church who had been unjustly killed. The path to something greater was now open. But that path would take a very long time. For centuries, Joan remained a controversial figure. The church acknowledged that her trial had been unjust, but it did not declare her a saint. She was venerated by the French people, celebrated in songs and stories and plays, but official recognition was slow in coming. The French Revolution complicated things further. The revolutionaries rejected the church and the monarchy, the two institutions most associated with Joan. For a time she was out of favour, a relic of the old regime, a symbol of superstition and royal power. But she came back. She always came back. In the 19th century, Joan became a national symbol again. France had been defeated by Prussia in 1870. The country was humiliated, divided, searching for something to believe in. Joan offered that something. She was the girl who had saved France before. Perhaps her spirit could save it again. Writers celebrated her. Artists painted her. Statues were erected in town squares across the country. She became a symbol of French resilience, French courage, French identity. And finally, the church acted. In 1909, Pope Pius X declared Joan blessed. This was the first step towards sainthood. It meant the church officially recognised her holiness. It meant she could be venerated by Catholics around the world. 11 years later, on May 16, 1920, Pope Benedict XV declared Joan of Arc a saint. Nearly 500 years after her death, the girl who had been burned as a heretic was recognised as one of the holiest people who ever lived. The ceremony took place in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Thousands attended. The French government sent official representatives. It was a moment of triumph, of vindication, of closure. Joan had been a peasant girl who heard voices. She had been a warrior who never killed anyone. She had been a prisoner who faced her accusers with courage and wit. She had been a martyr who died calling on Jesus. Now she was a saint. Her feast day is May 30, the anniversary of her death, the day the fire consumed her body but could not touch her soul. 600 years have passed since Joan of Arc rode into Orléans. The world she knew is gone. The kingdoms she fought for have become modern nations. The church that condemned her and later canonized her has changed in ways she could never have imagined. The weapons of war have evolved beyond recognition, and yet Joan endures. Her image is everywhere. Statues stand in Paris and Rouen and Orléans and 1,000 other places. Her face appears on stamps and coins and book covers. Her story has been told in plays and operas and films. Mark Twain wrote a novel about her. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play. Carl Dreyer made a silent film that is still considered one of the greatest movies ever made. Why, what is it about this peasant girl that continues to fascinate us? Part of it is the sheer improbability of her story. A teenage girl with no education, no training, no connections, somehow convinces a prince to give her an army. She leads that army to victory after victory. She crowns a king, and then she is betrayed, abandoned, tried, and burned alive. All before her 20th birthday. It sounds like fiction. It sounds like something a novelist would invent. But it happened. Every part of it is documented. We have the trial records, we have the letters, we have the testimonies of people who knew her, who fought beside her, who watched her die. Joan is real. That is part of her power. In a world full of legends and myths, she is historical fact. But there is more to it than that. Joan speaks to something deep in the human spirit. She represents the possibility that one person can make a difference, that courage matters, that faith matters, that the small and the weak can overcome the great and the powerful. She was a woman in a world ruled by men. She was a peasant in a world ruled by nobles. She was young in a world that valued age and experience. Everything was against her, and she succeeded anyway. That message resonates across centuries. It resonates with people who feel powerless, people who feel ignored, people who feel that the world is too big and too broken for them to change. Joan says otherwise. Joan says that one person, with enough conviction, can change everything. Of course, her story is also a tragedy. She was betrayed by the king she crowned. She was abandoned by the people she saved. She was murdered by her enemies, while her friends did nothing. There is a darkness in Joan's story that cannot be ignored. It reminds us that the world does not always reward goodness, that courage is not always enough, that even saints can be destroyed by the powerful and the corrupt. But Joan faced that darkness without flinching. She knew what was coming. Her voices had warned her. She knew she would not last long, and she kept going anyway. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. Not the victories, not the miracles, but the simple, stubborn courage of a girl who knew she was going to die and chose to do what was right anyway. She could have stayed in Domrémy. She could have married a local boy and raised children and lived a quiet life. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known what might have been. But she heard voices, and she believed them, and she acted on that belief, even when it cost her everything. What are we to make of those voices? Historians and scientists have proposed many explanations. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, tuberculosis affecting the brain. A vivid imagination shaped by religious culture and desperate times. Believers have their own answer. The voices were real. St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret truly spoke to Joan. God chose her for a mission, and she fulfilled it. We cannot prove either explanation. We cannot climb inside Joan's mind and see what she saw. We can only observe what she did, and what she did was extraordinary. Perhaps the voices were divine. Perhaps they were something else entirely, but they produced a girl who changed history. They produced a saint. In the end, maybe that is enough. Maybe we do not need to explain the mystery. Maybe we can simply accept it. A girl heard voices. She believed them. She saved a kingdom. She died for her faith. Her story is not comfortable. It does not have a happy ending, but it is true, and it matters. Joan of Arc matters because she reminds us what human beings are capable of, the heights we can reach, the depths we can sink to, the courage we can find in ourselves when everything seems lost. She was not perfect. She was impatient. She was stubborn. She could be harsh with those who doubted her. She was a teenager with all the intensity and certainty that implies. But she was also kind. She wept for her enemies. She tried to save English soldiers from damnation. She forgave the judges who condemned her. She died with a prayer on her lips. She was human, fully, completely human. And that is what makes her story so powerful. She was not a goddess or an angel. She was a girl who did impossible things. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let her story settle into your mind. The village of Domrémy, the voices in the garden, the long ride to Chinon, the walls of Orléans, the cathedral at Reims, the flames at Rouen. It all happened, every part of it. 600 years ago, in a world very different from ours, a peasant girl changed history. Her name was Joan. They called her the Maid, and she will never be forgotten.